This is Rogers TV.
Focused on quality and convenience, there isn't much you won't find at Marie's Mini Mart. Home-style breads, sandwiches, plus a variety of artisan breads and delicious single-serve desserts available exclusively at our Frecker Drive location. Marie's Mini Mart, with 25 locations wherever you go, there we are.
Hello, I'm Karl Wells. My guest today was, for much of her career, a national radio reporter with the CBC, and she covered many big stories. In 1992, she covered the LA race riots. In 1995, the Gustafson Lake standoff. She's also an award-winning radio documentarian. She's made a film, she's written a play, and now she has written a book which will be published next year. And it's a fascinating read about a little-known piece of journalism history that involves Newfoundland. It's my pleasure to welcome Theresa O'Leary to the program. Hi, Theresa.
Thank you, Karl. It's wonderful to be here.
Theresa, I want to talk a little bit about your career, first of all. You were in LA for the race riots in '92, and that Gustafson Lake standoff. These were really highly charged, volatile situations. What was it like as a reporter going into something like that? What was the experience like?
It was dramatic, absolutely, in both cases. I was working in Montreal as a news reporter for the CBC, and I went out to Vancouver to fill in as a national reporter for British Columbia, which I had done many times. And because the LA riots occurred on the west coast of North America, that was the role of a national reporter in BC to cover the west coast, so anything that happened in California. So anyway, so they flew me down to Toronto, National Radio News. Basically, they book everything for you, and they sent me down on a flight as soon as possible. And also, they created a buddy system because we were going into a very dangerous situation. You know, for the people who don't know that story, it really was a pivotal story because it was the first time, I think, at that time, it was the first time that a videotaped assault by police officers occurred.
This was Rodney King.
Exactly. And so it seemed like a slam dunk. There was videotape of them assaulting this black man, an African-American man. And of course, it set off race tensions in the United States. Flash forward a year later when the trial occurred and the police officers were charged and tried, and they were not convicted. They were acquitted. And that just sparked an incredible reaction within Los Angeles. The core area that was involved was South Central LA. That's where a lot of the violence occurred. So jumping back to when, you know, I flew in and I met a fellow reporter from Ottawa, Susan Murray, at the airport. And as soon as I got off the airplane, actually, I remember it so vividly because it was very dramatic. And when I got off the airplane, all I could smell was the smell of smoke and fire. And I did discover that there were 4,000 fires burning in LA that day. And there was no point in calling the fire department. It was out of control. And also there was no point in calling the police because the violence that had been sparked was out of control. Truck drivers, white truck drivers, were being pulled out of their vehicles, their trucks, and beaten up. There was looting, vandalism, assaults going on all over the place. So it was a very volatile situation. So Susan and I get in our car, and she drives, and I basically jump in and out. And our goal is to go to the center point of the conflict, which was in South Central. And on the way, though, what we saw was remarkable. And I mean, it really was anarchy, Karl. I've never experienced anything like it before or since. As I said, all the institutions that we did rely on to keep our cities safe, you couldn't rely on them. So people were on their own. So, for instance, I can vividly remember dozens and dozens of homeowners standing on their roofs with hoses, trying to keep them cool so that the fire wouldn't flick over onto theirs. As we were driving along, a guy cut in front of us. We had to slam on the brakes, and he had a dolly with a safe. Now, I don't know if he owned the business he was taking it from or not, but it certainly seemed like he was stealing it. There was looting everywhere. It was chaos. It really was chaos. And so we went in, and we went further and further in, gathering tape as we went in that way. This is before the internet. So we were using, the old Sony tape recorders. And we went into South Central in the core area. By that time, the police had really shut it down. There were no lights. It was getting near dark. There were no lights. It felt like you were going into a war zone, and it certainly was. And so basically, we interviewed authorities about what the status of situation was, and then we were told to get out. So we went back then to the hotel, and by that, the curfew had not been declared yet, but that night at midnight, a curfew was declared. And I'll tell you, the part I found the scariest, actually, was driving to Burbank, California, which is near, LA, well, in LA, but it's, a suburb, from my hotel with my story. So I had my tape, from my tape recorder. I had my script written. I had my clips all picked out. I had to go into a studio. This is pre-internet, and at NPR, National Public Radio in the United States. And so a technician there put it together for me, and I voiced my script there, and he put it together, and then we sent it off to Toronto, to National Radio News. And that was the point when I was scared. At 1 o'clock in the morning, driving to Burbank, there was nobody around. It was dead quiet after all of this chaos for hours, So it was quite a dramatic scene.
Wow. Now I want to take you all the way back to the beginnings, I guess, of the business and talk about Race to the Cape. It's a great read, by the way, Theresa.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Now, the idea for this story really started with stories that your dad used to tell you about your great aunt Kitty.
Absolutely.
Tell me
That's
about
where it
that.
all started.
Yeah.
Absolutely. My father's from Portugal Cove South, which is the community closest to Cape Race on the southern shore. And it was his beloved cove. He was always talking about the cove. And I grew up in Wabush, Labrador, which is a landlocked community far from the ocean. So Dad was always talking about the cove and his parents and grandparents and cousins and ancestors, the shipwrecks down there. But he would say to me, he said, "Oh, and your great Aunt Kitty, she worked at the telegraph at Cape Race." And that made me very proud, even though when I was a kid, I didn't even know what that was. And then he also would talk about the shipwrecks, and then he would say, the AP had a news boat at Cape Race, chasing the news and the mail from England and Europe. And they were throwing them overboard from the steamships into the ocean. So, of course, I'm a little girl. I'm trying to imagine that. It's like broad sheets of newspapers floating around, But the key...
Soggy paper.
Yeah. But the key piece in there was that the mail delivery at that time came via steamship. And the mail officer on board the steamship would put the mail or the news or the latest information from England and Europe and put it into these little small, about this size canister, a steel canister. It had a little hook on it, and it had a flag. And so the hook could be jigged with a cod jigger. And that's what they were doing.
Now, this really all started to take off with a handful of young entrepreneurs in places like Halifax, Boston, New York, who were using rowboats. What were they doing with the rowboats?
Well, Karl, it all started with the rowboat news. In the 1830s and the 1840s, before there was an electric telegraph on land, and before there was an underground telegraph under the Atlantic between the continents, The only way to get the news was from those steamships arriving from Liverpool, mostly in England, but also from France and elsewhere. And so in New York and in Boston, the newspapers had their own rowboats, and they had staff that would go out. There were no news reporters then, so they just called them staff. So staff would go out, and they would row out early in the morning to the outside of the harbors in New York City and Boston. They're kind of like St. John's, where you have the pilot boat has to bring you in through the Narrows. Same thing in New York City. And so these boats would, the rowboats would go out there first thing in the morning, in the dark, to see what steamships had arrived overnight. And then they would go on board the steamships. They would talk to the captain, they would talk to the mail officer, they would get any news that was on paper, which there wasn't a lot, but there was a European News Digest. And then they basically would collect all the news and information they could about what was the latest. And this was the latest news. You know, it was 2 weeks old, or maybe a month old, but it was the latest news. And so they would then row back to the harbor, the wharves in New York City and Boston, and then they would take that information to the offices of the newspapers in New York City.
Very labor intensive.
Totally. And it was very hard work because it was cold and rainy and windy, and you know, it wasn't nice weather to go out in those rowboats every morning.
What kind of news were they looking for specifically? Were they looking for the big scoop, or was there a particular type of news that the readers in New York, say at the time, were looking for from Europe?
I think that any news was interesting to them because there was no communication except by steamship mail delivery. And that could take weeks, it could take months, or letters or correspondence could get lost. So the continents were isolated from one another, and people suffered greatly as a result. And that meant even from like governments trying to contact governments, businesses trying to contact businesses. You know, the governments of England, mostly what they were concerned with was the duties and the taxes that they were getting on the codfish. Business, they were most concerned with the price of cotton, because slavery was underway in the United States, and there was a huge manufacturing industry that had expanded and grown out of that in the United Kingdom. And so they wanted to know the price for cotton that was on the London stock market. That was a key piece of information. And Daniel Craig, who is a main character in the book that we will be talking about, he was the guy who could always get that piece of information first. And it made him unbeatable.
Yeah, and Daniel Craig developed a real thirst for news gathering.
Absolutely.
I don't know whether it was because he was a young guy and full of energy and this was something new that was developing and he could see the future, or what. But I mean, he used carrier pigeons, he used Pony Express.
That's right, exactly. It was remarkable what he did, absolutely. Yeah. And what was driving him, who knows? I have two theories. One, he came from a large family in rural New Hampshire, and his father died when he was quite young, and he was the youngest of 8. And so basically he had to make his own way in the world. He didn't come from a wealthy, connected family. He was on his own. And so there was that drive to make his own way, a self-made man, so to speak. Secondly, I think he just inherently or innately had it in him, this curiosity to know, and to know now, and to know first. Yeah. You know, that's what drove him, and that's what drives every news reporter. It's what drove me, and not everybody has that quality. Yeah. There are a lot of journalists who are not news reporters, who don't have that sort of dead focus on getting that news. Yeah. But he had it for sure in spades. And he ordered carrier pigeons from Africa, brought them over, and he was in Boston in his early days, and he married a woman named Helena, and he ordered these carrier pigeons, he trained them, then he would go out on the rowboat, get on the ships, like far off, as far as he could go, and then get on the ships, and then he'd write in these little pieces of tissue paper the headlines, basically, of the news, and then send it back to the shore, the wharf in Boston, and there was his wife waiting to receive the birds, take the information, hurry up to the telegraph office and get the telegraph sent to, and again, price of cotton, Jacob Little was a Wall Street operator. He was the guy that wanted to know that information. And Craig, he was a big client of Craig's. So.
And the competition became so fierce that at one point the newspapers said, hey guys, we're knocking each other out here.
Yeah.
We should really cooperate.
Yes.
And create something that allows all of us to share.
Yes.
And
yes.
this was the formation of the Associated Press.
It was indeed. And you know, it started with the fighting, like you say, because the rowboats in New York, it got so fierce at one point. They were sort of using these slingshot-like devices to flick metal pins at each other's heads. And this is what was going on. So that's why finally they said, you know what, we can't keep this up. This is getting ridiculous. So they formed a harbor combine in which they would have one rowboat go out and get the news for all of them. But it was a very loose coalition. And more importantly, after that, what happened was the Mexican War broke out in the United States. And as a result of that, the newspapers in New York, and there were 6 that were the top 6, they wanted to cover the war. All of them sent somebody down to the war front to give them the news. But the telegraph fees were atrocious because it was a new technology. And newspapers, you know, are frugal-minded to start with. And so they decided that to save money on covering the Mexican War, that they would bring together, you know, the Associated Press. And it was 6 newspapers in New York. These were fierce competitors. Back then, the news was really opinion-driven. All the newspapers were owned by rich, wealthy men or political men, and they were advertising-driven. There was no fact-based news at all. And so when they came together because of the cost of the telegraph fees and formed the Associated Press, which was initially a loose coalition, they did something remarkable. And they didn't even realize it because they were doing it to save money on their own budgets, right? Each newspaper. But the reality was, now that there were 6 newspapers or 6 clients to satisfy, right? It couldn't have opinion in it. The news had to be fact-based. It had to be done from an objective point of view. It had to be based on reliable reports from authorities. And these were basic ideas that Daniel Craig institutionalized when the Associated Press formed. And he had no idea, I don't think initially, what impact he would have. That organization is still in existence today. It is still one of the best news agencies to find non-opinionated news.
And one thing that is still with us today is that need to get to be first with the news.
So true.
And what the Associated Press then came up with was the idea of going to Newfoundland, right?
Yep.
And specifically, Cape Race.
Absolutely.
Talk about that.
Right. Cape Race is on the southeast tip of the Avalon Peninsula of Newfoundland. And it is first landfall in North America. So what that means is that steamships back then, and even today, ships will, if they're going to North America, to Montreal, or to New York City, they will chart their course for Cape Race. And when they come to Cape Race, they will slow down. So anyway, Daniel Craig, he worked in Boston, he worked in New York City, he worked in Halifax. He knew about Cape Race. He knew that Cape Race was the first place in North America to get the news. And he had his eye on Cape Race right from the beginning. When he joined the Associated Press in 1850 as an agent, and within 6 months became general manager, because he had such a vision. And even then, he started writing letters. And that was before, you know, there was a telegraph actually at Cape Race. But it was a key point because of that charting of, you know, that's a first landfall. That's where the ships kind of like breathed a sigh of relief. There's North America, you know? So anyway, at Cape Race, it's amazing what occurred because, you know, Daniel Craig was quite the extraordinary newsman himself. But what took place at Cape Race was so far above what they did. I mean, New York City Harbor and Boston Harbor outside those harbors are not that, you know, the seas are not that
A little calmer.
a little calmer, thank you, sorry. So they have more calmer seas, whereas the Cape Race, as we know, it's foggy, it's rainy, it's windy, the seas are tormented down that way. And so the Daniel Craig hired a man named Captain Murphy, Captain John Murphy, to captain this rowboat. Now the rowboat was a little bit bigger than a regular rowboat. It was a whaling boat, so it had a flat bottom, so it was a bit bigger, but it still involved 4 oarsmen and the captain. And those guys, I mean, our historian, Mr. Proust, you know, he wrote about it in a paragraph in our history. And he said no one could imagine the daring that was involved in getting the news at Cape Race during those days, because the steamships would arrive. There's no harbor at Cape Race to get in and be nice and calm. You're basically passing Cape Race in those steamships, slowing down into neutral, throwing overboard these cans filled with the mail and the news, and then continuing on your journey. Could happen in the middle of the night, could happen any time of the day or night. And so Captain Murphy and his crew, they were, you know, their job was to row out in these seas, find these canisters in the middle of these seas, and then jig them. You know, they were jigging for, not for cod, they were jigging for news. And then they would bring the news canisters back to the Telegraph. But I mean, sometimes getting back to the Telegraph was very difficult. They had the west landing, down at Cape Race there's an east landing and a west landing, and AP spent a lot of time trying to figure out which landing would be the safest to get into. They chose the west landing. And so when they came in there, I mean, you had to have the right conditions to be able to come in there safely, because there were so many rocks and shoals there that they could be killed on. So getting back in there would have been a very difficult job. Then once they were on land, then they had to walk up the hill to Cape Race. Not a far distance, but after everything they'd been through, they probably were tired, you know. And then they had to break open those canisters. They were soldered shut, you know, with welding devices.
So for waterproofing.
Exactly. And so they had to, you know, get them open, and then they had to send off the news as soon as they could to New York City. And so the reason why this incredible race to the Cape occurred was because the news could get to New York City in 3 to 4 hours along the telegraph network, as opposed to 4 or 5 days when the ship would arrive. And as you said, I don't know why, but we humans are obsessed with speed. We continually think, then and now, that the faster we communicate, the better it will be for us. But in the end, I mean, I think we're seeing with the internet today that's not really true, or maybe it is, I don't know. That's a discussion for another day, but.
There's a great story in the book about a telegraph reporter, I guess you'd call him, named Thomas Scanlon. And he gets a message to President Abraham Lincoln,
Yes.
which is an historic message. Tell us about that.
Yes, it's an incredible story, actually. And luckily we have that story because Joey Smallwood wrote it back in the 1930s, our former premier. But Thomas Scanlon was a really fascinating man as well. He was a true telegraph man. He was from Brigus, and he got excited when the telegraph came into Brigus. He was a young man, and that was really typical of the telegraph men of that day. They were young teenage men, boys really, but they could learn the telegraph skill very quickly. In 1861, Thomas Scanlon did something remarkable. So the Civil War had broken out in the United States just a few months earlier, and England had declared its siding with the South. It was a conflict, as many people know, between the North and South in the United States. And initially, England had sided with the South. But then there was a lot of pushback from northern people in the northern states and people within England. And so by August, it had changed its mind, and it had decided to be neutral in the conflict and to leave it to the Americans to work out. So the dispatch was written that was the position of England, and it was sent to St. John's this time, not Cape Race. So it came in, the ship came in at St. John's.
And wasn't the dispatch signed by Queen Victoria?
Yes, exactly, sorry. And so then in came the dispatch, and the telegraph operators in the city, of course, were waiting for steamships to deliver the news. In comes this very important message, But unfortunately, at that moment in time, the telegraph lines were down from St. John's to La Manche. And La Manche was a mining site on the isthmus, basically where the Avalon Peninsula joins the rest of the province, between Trinity Bay and Placentia Bay. Now, on that isthmus, there was a place called La Manche, there was a telegraph station there. So, all of the telegraph operators in St. John's got together on a Saturday night, and they were just despondent that this news was here and they couldn't transmit the news. And in the back, this young man piped up, Thomas Scanlon, said, "I'll get it there." And what he proposed and what he did, it was what a journey that man took. What a journey. Because he took a buggy, he left at midnight with the dispatches on in his knapsack on the back. He got a horse and buggy to Kelligrews, to Conception Bay South. 2.5 hours it took that. Then he was going to get a sailboat across the bay to Brigus, but there was no wind. So then he had to walk. He walked further south until he found a fisherman in bed, roused him, got him to take him across the bay to Brigus. Gets to Brigus, there's no horse to be found. Walks to Spaniards Bay. In Spaniards Bay, finds a horse and buggy to take him to New Harbor. But within 4 miles, the horse goes lame. So he has to walk to New Harbor. So he gets to New Harbor finally. There's across the bay there's a ferryman who can take him across, but he's on the other side of the bay. So he starts yelling, becomes hoarse from yelling, but the ferryman never hears him. So he walks on, finds a house, borrows a gun, goes back, shoots off the gun. The ferryman comes over and gets him finally, takes him across the bay, and then he has to walk 3 miles to La Manche, to the telegraph station. He gets to the telegraph station, it's not working. He has to repair it. And meanwhile, there are mosquitoes eating him alive. And I don't know exactly how long this journey has taken. Now, I'm going to work it out for the book, so the answer will be in the book next year. But it certainly would have been 10 to 12 hours.
Yeah.
So we're talking, by the time he got there, it was noon, and all these mosquitoes are eating him alive. The local boys are fanning him with branches from the trees so that he could do his work. But he did it. And he wouldn't leave there until he had confirmation that it had been received by President Lincoln.
Theresa, all the best with the book. It's an amazing read. And I'm
you
sure
so
you're
much.
going to have great success with it when it comes out next year. Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thanks, Karl.
And that's it for this edition of Karl Wells' Point to Point. Thank you for watching. See you again next time.
If you want convenience, Marie's Mini Mart is here for you. A one-stop